So, well, the idea of this interview, we are interviewing a lot of sci-fi, writers from all over the world. Here in Argentina, there's a big tradition of writers, magical realism. I don't know if you know Jorge Luis Borges.
Are you kidding me? Of course.
Oh.
Huge influence.
Yeah, I knew it. Well, yeah, when I remember I used to say to my friends, yeah, I'm sure these guys read Borges, Cortázar and all that, so I had the chance to talk about it. So let's start from the beginning, as we usually do. You were little, maybe, I know, and how did you start your love for literature and especially for sci-fi when you were little?
I always liked horror. I was a big horror fan. Started reading horror at a young age, science fiction as well. I was a big fan of an American television show called The Twilight Zone, which seemed to hit both things. It was horror. One week it would be horror, one week it would be science fiction, one week it would be fantasy. One week it almost just might be a straight drama. And I really liked that kind of anthological storytelling. And when I first got my first job on Star Trek The Next Generation, I knew about Star Trek, of course, who didn't know about Star Trek? But I wasn't a Star Trek fanatic. But I was a fan of the type of storytelling they were doing, which was anthological in nature. For all it really, if you look at the show, not Star Trek today so much, but back in the 90s, it was anthological. Star Trek The Next Generation could be anything, any week. And I liked that a lot. That appealed to me. Yeah.
And do you remember which ones were the first literary, authors that you start reading when you were little? You say, well, The Twilight Zone.
Oh,
actually, no. But it's very interesting because The Twilight Zone, all the scripts were written by a lot of sci-fi authors, including Ray Bradbury.
So, of course, Ray Bradbury, when The Martian Chronicles was a big deal when I was a kid. And I would read I read The Martian Chronicles, of course. I knew, like you, I think I knew who Rod Serling was because I loved The Twilight Zone. And I also would watch the show, and I knew who all the writers were for the most part, Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson and so forth. I knew when if I saw Charles Beaumont's name on an episode of The Twilight Zone, it was going to be a particularly good one, or if it was Rod Serling himself, although I would later find out he rewrote a lot of them. And it's one of those rare times in television where the writer was kind of the star, the showrunner, the auteur, as they say in France. And now, of course, with television being so popular around the world, the showrunner as an auteur is very normal now, But, in terms of, I would have prepared better for this interview if I had these questions, because you're going to ask me something I won't remember. But, I think many people my age would say Stephen King was a huge influence. And he was to me, when I was reading his books. I think the first Stephen King book I read was Firestarter. That's how far back that goes, Thanks. And I also I read a lot of short fiction. You mentioned Borges. I was a big fan. His short stories are amazing, and I'm sure Rod Serling read his work too. And I liked short story collections. There was a very good, collection of stories called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. They were little suspense stories, and that's another show I liked, was Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which came before The Twilight Zone. And I was more really into movies than anything as a kid, and the way movies told stories. And I liked horror and suspense. You know, I was a fan of, growing up as a kid, I had to sneak into movies because they wouldn't let you in. But I loved Dario Argento and Alfred Hitchcock and a lot of the suspense filmmakers at the time.
Romero, did you?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, you know, as a kid, you hear about Night of the Living Dead for many years before you see it. And actually, the first movie I saw was Dawn of the Dead in the theaters, which was a formative experience, as was the original Halloween in 1978, when I would have been 12 years old, 13 years old. And I'll never forget the communal experience of being in the theater. And I even recorded the audience reactions on a tape recorder. And I had them for many years.
Wow.
And I had it for a long time. It was very interesting. So I've always been an avid reader, but cinema has been my main thing.
As a storyteller in general, I mean, I think storytellers, writers or directors, they want to express ideas. Well, Borges did, and most of sci-fi, it's about expressing an idea, maybe a philosophical idea. That's the thing I love about these anthology shows like Star Trek, the Outer Limits, you know. And well, and what about you? What are the ideas you wanted to express through your writing, your philosophy of life?
I don't, you know, I don't know. It's a really good question and no one's ever asked me that question. I'd have to really think about that. Wish I had my questions in advance. I could have given could have written an answer ahead of time.
Yeah.
But it's a really great question. You know, I think I like stories that make you look at reality in a slightly different way, or maybe twist your perception of reality. And that's just a theme that maybe has just emerged. It's the kind of fiction I like. You mentioned Borges. He would often play with reality. I loved H.P. Lovecraft as well, and anybody who could make me look at reality in a different way. Now, of course, I think now I understand that my body of work has a lot more to do with the kinds of things I'm doing on Cosmos, which is the ultimate reality show, and certainly more mind-bending than anything I could invent, because nature is way more interesting than anything that I could think up. And I think that's a little bit of the epitome of my writing career is Cosmos, which should be coming out next week in Argentina as well as the rest of the world. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I remember.
You guys get National Geographic?
Yes, of course. I actually, when I was little, I used to watch over and over again the VHS of Carl Sagan Cosmos.
Yeah.
And then I was very glad to hear that you were involved in the Cosmos. I wouldn't call it a remake. It's more like a update. And I really.
Or a continuation, because the stories are all new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I really enjoy the Cosmos, and in a way, sci-fi authors have this tendency to have a curiosity for science astronomy, because they deal with the subject as time travel, parallel universe. Have you ever thought, when you were maybe in your youth, to study this kind of thing, physics, instead of become a writer?
I've always been, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite subjects in college was physics, and for some reason, I really was. I have always enjoyed the conceptual aspects of science. I'm not good at math, and in fact, I don't have a college. I couldn't finish my college degree because I couldn't meet the math requirement. So I went to college, but I didn't come away with the degree. Yeah, I mean, science has always been part of my writing. It's always had some. Even my one television foray into horror, which was a show called Salem, we based it in nature. Like the magic in the show has some connection to, no one's waving magic wands. It's all kind of scientific in a way, in a fantastical way.
Yeah, I remember there's a series called Flash Forward. Yeah, I think the idea was great, but it was, sadly canceled because it was great. A lot of people ask me if there's going to be a project with the same idea or a movie or something. It exists the possibility of continuing because it was great as an idea. I think it was great.
Yeah, I did. I worked on the first episode, the pilot, and wrote and produced that with a guy named David Goyer. But I didn't do the show because I was doing another show at the time called 24, and I couldn't leave, and didn't necessarily want to leave. But what they did with the show, I thought the show should have been a little more anthological. They got really into the mythology versus the anthology. And that was a show to me because 7 billion people experienced the same thing at the same time. You had 7 billion stories to tell all around the world. Like, I wanted to set a story in Argentina, a story in Japan, a story in, China, a story in Burbank, California. You could have done all these different stories, and the show, in that regard, could come back because it can be about anyone. But I don't know that there are any plans for that.
When was the moment in your life when you knew you wanted to become a writer?
It just kind of happened. I'm sure you can relate to this. I wanted to be, I was, as I said, a big fan of movies, and I wanted to be an actor because I thought the actors made up the words. I was too young to understand. And then I found out they weren't making up the words, and that I didn't want to be an actor. But I started writing at a very young age, maybe 10 years old, because it was free. It was a creative outlet. I liked drawing too. My mother was an artist, is an artist. But it was a way of creating something that I could give to people to read. And so it just kind of happened. And I wanted to be a movie director and writer. And my career began in television, which was, I didn't realize at the time, was a great path. But it just happened. I don't think I ever set out to say I'm a storyteller, I'm a writer. It just kind of happened. It was a natural thing. And by the time I got a job, I'd been writing for a long time, so I wasn't just starting out,
How do you remember in what circumstance you arrived to the Star Trek, production? I remember there was another writer, Moore, I think, is a friend of yours, yeah. And you both started at the same time, I think, like doing the story editing or something like that.
Yeah.
So how was that first opportunity you have, and what do you remember about those first steps?
Well, Ron started a little before I did on the show. And when I got to Star Trek The Next Generation in June of 1990, it was Ron Moore, and it was my mentor, my first boss, Michael Piller. And it was just the two of them. All the writing staff had been let go, and they were rebuilding the writing staff. And while I was there, they would hire other writers that would become very crucial to the Star Trek world. Jerry Taylor, Joe Menosky, Renee Echevarria, a Cuban writer, and a guy named Narain Shankar who does The Expanse, a TV show called The Expanse now. All this core group came together. A core group who would all become very successful. I remember being really scared, and my first script, which was a rewrite, I did with Ron Moore. And I remember I learned one of my first important lessons in writing for television, which is you're not alone. Like, writing does not have to be a solitary experience. It's much more fun when you're doing it with somebody, and somebody who's as talented as Ron Moore. And so I owe Ron Moore a lot, and I owe a lot of people a lot for helping me be a better writer and being generous with their time and talent, because nothing happens alone.
Did you still get together with Moore and the other writers from the show, from Star Trek?
Now?
Yeah.
Or
no. They are still.
Oh, now? Yeah, I stay. Yeah, I mean, I emailed with Ron recently. We don't. It's funny. Yeah, from time to time. All of us don't really get together all that much, but we've all stayed in touch for sure. Yeah, we were all, except for Jerry Taylor and Michael Piller, we were all in our 20s. You know, I was 25 years old when I first started. We really had no business being there in some ways, but we were lucky.
And then you come up with the story for First Contact and Generations, that there were the two movies. They were great, by the way. And how did you come up with the idea, first for Generations and then for First Contact?
Well, the movie, Ron Moore and I were asked by Rick Berman, who was actually the big boss of everybody. We were asked to write Generations, and it was our first movie, and we were still working on the show. And in fact, we were writing All Good Things, the finale, at the same time we were writing the movie. And many people would argue that the finale turned out better than the movie, which I agree with. The next, I don't remember I remember that Generations had a lot of things it had to do. It had to pass the baton from one generation from Kirk to Picard. It had some kind of time travel-like component to it. And it had a lot of people voicing their opinion, the studio, the actors. It was hard. It was hard as first-time screenwriters for Ron and I to navigate that. And if you ever, there is a DVD of the movie with commentary that Ron and I did many years ago. It's a great commentary because it's very honest about how hard it was and why the movie really, to us, was not as great as it could have been. I think a lot of people would have rather seen Kirk and Picard enemies at first, like locked in battle and then working together, and then just more captain stuff versus scrambling. They were scrambling eggs in a kitchen. That's just not how we envisioned the movie, just kind of how it happened. First Contact was a very different experience. First Contact, Generations was very successful at the box office, and we just could come up with whatever we wanted. And we wanted to do the Borg, because the Borg hadn't really been done as a villain since Best of Both Worlds, the very famous two-part episode on Next Generation, and we wanted to do the Borg, and we wanted to do the Borg going back in time to change history, and it was really everything we intended it to be, and I think it was a better movie.
And what about all the good things? I think that the final episode were great, and it's very interesting, the idea of a person moving in free period of your time. How did you come up with that idea specifically? You were inspired in any movie or any short story?
Oh yeah, I think it was, my inspiration was Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And he had a narrative device of someone who'd become unstuck in time. I don't remember what. But Ron Moore, who I wrote the episode with, he had the idea of, we have to bring Q back. And I think I probably had the idea of Picard becoming unstuck in time, which allowed us to see the characters at the very beginning of the series. It allowed us to see the characters as you knew them in that moment, and the characters in the future. And it was cool time travel, but it was also a great way to explore the characters. And but it was Vonnegut.
And what about Seth MacFarlane? How did you knew him, and when do you decide to participate in the Orville?
Well, Seth I met 20 years ago when I was doing a show called Star Trek Enterprise, and one of the writers on Star Trek Enterprise, a guy named David Goodman, had worked with Seth on Family Guy, and Seth he was a huge fan of Star Trek, and he wanted to come and meet me, and I ended up putting him on the show twice in a very small role, and playing an engineer, and we became friends, but we didn't work together until Cosmos back in 2014. We were just friends up to that point, and while we were doing Cosmos, we started talking about what if we could do the next Star Trek series. And at that time, I don't think there were any plans to do Star Trek, a TV show, because these new movies were out. So he decided to create his own kind of version of Star Trek, and he asked me to work on it. And the thing about the Orville is it's really not a comedy. It's a science fiction show. The characters are more grounded. They're more like people would be in real life, and there is some comedy. But if you really look at it, it's a drama with some comedy. Not a comedy with some drama. I mean, I've never done a co-production, but yeah, of course I would. There was a movie that came out of Argentina. I don't remember the director's name that I really liked, which was an anthology film called Wild Tales.
Yeah, Demian Cifrón.
Yeah, and he's somebody I wanted to meet on a project, but I thought that was a really good anthology.
I can get you his contact if you want.
Oh no, I know we know how to reach his representatives, but it just occurred to me that was an Argentinian filmmaker that movie got people's attention here.
Yes, and do you know a lot of directors from the sci-fi indie circuit in the US? Because I started talking with them. I discovered a movie called Ink. I don't know if you know the movie Ink. Jamie Winans. It's excellent. It was made with $100,000, but it's so well INK. And it's so well done with low budget, and it's a challenge to do that with just a little money. And then I contact the actor. It's Christopher Soren Kelly, who also is a Borges fan, and he started doing short films. And now he did a movie called Infinity Chamber with Travis Miller, who I talked to. Well, actually, we are trying to organize something in Argentina with him. Travis Milloy did Infinity Chamber. Christopher is in there as an actor, and now he wrote a movie called The Tangle, who is winning every festival in the US. I saw it because he sent me the link to see it before. It hasn't been released yet, but I saw it. Oh. It's so great, and it's the type of science fiction you would like. I think you should meet Christopher, because now he wants to do a movie adaptation inspiring Borges, actually. And he's an independent actor and director, but you should meet him. If you want, I can introduce you to him.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah, absolutely. I'm writing all this down. Let's stay in touch and make these introductions. Do you ever get to Los Angeles? Come out to Los Angeles?
Well, my idea is in 2 years to go there because, I love cinema, I love writing, and I work with a lot of people there from here. I have a lot of friends in Miami, in LA. So my idea is to, spend 2 years here and then just, go there and start because I like to, be in the process of the production. So I help a lot of people here to get fine. I write things because I discover a lot of people very talented who nobody know even in the US. So I start saying, oh my God, you should do this, and so I try to connect. Because as a fan, I say, we must do this. We must. And I also
You're a producer.
I
That's
guess.
what you're doing.
No, but as a producer, you think that the role of a good producer, in a way, is to find talented people and say, okay, we have to do this. Is that what you think about the role of the producer?
Well, it's a title that is so ubiquitous here. Everybody has a producing title.
Yeah.
But a really good there's a thing we call a line producer who does finance and scheduling. But a really good producer does bring the talent, brings it all together, usually along with the director. But really, just a really great producer, somebody like the great producers in history, David Selznick, or D.W. Griffith, or Jerry Bruckheimer. Today, there are certain producers who just their movies are going to be high quality.
Yeah.
And I think that sounds like that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was always a big fan. No, I was always a big fan of this genre, and I always noticed there's a lot of people that they are known and they are so talented. Say, let's do something. The problem with artists is they are shy. I don't know, in the US they don't want to approach. They are like they spend a lot of time the creative work, but they don't have time to do like the social to start the project. So it's really exciting to do that. And I want to ask you about 24, because it's something I saw the 24, and I always wanted to ask you about the challenge of writing something that happens in real time, because I tried to do some little project with my friends when I was younger, and I find it really hard to build something, and I really admire the way that you do it. How can you do a real-time series?
It's when I came into 24 in the 5th season, no, the 6th. I was just there the last 2 seasons. And to me, as a fan of the show, I remember going in to talk to the showrunner, Howard Gordon, and I said, I really just want to work on the show because I want to know how you make it, how you write it. It's like magic. I want to know how the magic trick is done. And I would soon find out the magic trick is done with 8 guys sitting in a room banging their heads against the wall. And it just turns out it's not easy. And it's a particular challenge because you're juggling. It helps that you have different storylines to cut to. You could never just do one story in real time, because being able to cut to different stories, you're cheating a little bit. You're just going back to that other story just when you need to. You didn't have to watch anyone eat or go to the bathroom or, you know, any of the things that might happen. But it was challenging. You know, it was a show that, because it was also serialized as a TV show, you constantly had to remind the audience what was happening, and you know, it was intricate, but it was a thriller, and I loved it, and I love suspense, and so it was a lot of fun to work on.
Yeah, actually, I remember some episodes you come up with the story of the next generations. They have some elements of suspense. So I'm going to ask you if you like also the suspense genre. If you have read, I don't know, writers, suspense writers, or you have seen. Well, Hitchcock, the anthology, was based on suspense. So in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, you know, my favorite director, and I'm sure that many people would say this, but is Hitchcock, and I just love thrillers. I mean, it's probably my favorite kind of movie, and probably one of the reasons I like horror too. So, gravitate more towards psychological horror than violence and gore and stuff like that. But without question, I was obsessed with Hitchcock's movies. And I'm also a big James Bond fan. I loved the Ian Fleming novels growing up too, and those were thrillers as well. The Fleming books.
And there's a movie called Let the Right One In, and there was a remake. It's a horror movie, but I don't call it a horror movie. I have this discussion with a lot of horror directors here. It's more like existential story, right? And I prefer that kind of horror. Is that the kind of horror do you like?
Excuse me. Let the Right One In is I didn't see the remake. I think you have to categorize it as horror. First of all, it's one of the great movies of the past 20 years. But it's about vampires. So I would disagree with, I think you almost, well, how about this? You have to put it in the subgenre of vampire movies. It is one of the best vampire movies ever, I think, ever made. It is just a great movie. It's just so well made. It's very psychological. It has flashes of violence and some CGI cats that don't hold up too good.
Yeah, that's true.
But what a great, and in fact, it just does some things in it that are so great. Like sometimes the little girl vampire, sometimes they would cut to her when she was killing someone and it was an older woman. And I thought, I haven't seen that done since The Exorcist. When William Friedkin would sometimes cut to different actresses who were older during sequences where the girl, Linda Blair, who was 12, was freaking out. And it's a psychological nuance that's not necessary, but it's terrifying and subliminal. Anyway, I could go on and on about Let the Right One In. I mean, it's a great movie.
Yeah, for me, it's not even horror. I mean, it has this cover of horror, but in the way, is this relationship between these two characters. I mean, the character of the girl was evidently converted as a child. He suffers this curse of being always a child, right? And in a way, it's like a drama dressed as a horror film, and that's the incredible thing about this movie. And and since then I'm trying. As I spend a lot of time, finding all these gems in the independent film. I try to find this kind of horror. Actually, it's a novel I read recently called, it's a Spanish, it's from Argentina, El Conserje y la Eternidad. It's like the concierge, I know the word, and the eternity is about a vampire who lives in Buenos Aires. and the book is the diary of him, and it's so existential because he kills people, but he was converted as an old man, so he's like senile in a way. And it's so great. I mean, well, I know the writer, and now here they're trying to do a movie. Oh, you should read that.
Has it been translated into English?
I'm working on it because the writer, I mean, he was translated to French and to German, but not to English. But don't worry, I'm working. I'm also in that process.
Well, my favorite horror films tend to be non-English speaking. You know, you mentioned Let the White One In, which I think was Swedish. You know, my favorite horror films of the past 20 years would have to be Good Night Mommy, the Austrian.
Yes.
And I really liked Martyrs, the French horror film.
Yeah, oof. That's a hard one to see.
Well, that's a very existential horror film.
Yeah, that's true.
The ending is as existential as one gets, you know. This woman, she's seen the meaning of life and death, and instead of telling us what it is, she blows her brains out. I don't think you get more nihilistic or than that. But those are like groundbreaking horror films, right?
Yeah, actually. Well,
they have different sensibilities. And that's why I think even as a kid, I sought out Dario Argento movies because there was something different about them than the normal movies, you know?
No, yeah, actually, Good Night Mommy, it has something of this Hitchcock atmosphere in it. I don't know why. When I saw it, it reminds me a lot of Hitchcock movies in the way it is built. I mean, and again, it is built with it's a low budget film, I think. And there's this, idea that you need a lot of budget to do a sci-fi film, a horror film, but it's not true. With good ideas, you can do an excellent films. Would you agree?
Well, I totally agree, and I think I believe that horror films, in particular, are a creative breeding ground for upcoming artists. You know, because there's a lot of horror films, particularly the low budget ones, it's about the filmmaking, you know, editing and shot. Like it's you don't have to have big special effects, you know. Whether it's John Carpenter's Halloween, which is a very simple movie, but it's just incredibly well made. Good Night Mommy is 3 characters in a house. It was low budget. I tried to get the cinematographer to do my movie, Books of Blood. He almost did, but I didn't get him. But it is Hitchcockian, and it's very intentional filmmaking. It's very precise. It's very controlled in a great way. And it's one of those few movies I remember in the theater, and I always see movies in the theater when possible. I almost had to leave, you know, when they had the mother tied up and they were taking the stitches out of her mouth or whatever they were doing. I just almost couldn't take it. That's a sign of a good movie, a good horror movie. It's like I have to leave. This is too much. It was great. Yeah, it was great. And horror, science fiction and horror in different cultures is, you know, I read this book. I wish I could remember what it was called. It was a new take on Frankenstein, written by an author out of Iraq. And it was a metaphor for the Iraq War, told from the perspective of citizens living, just regular people living there. And the Frankenstein monster was that was created out of the bodies of wartime civilian victims in a city that was bombed by American shells, or what was an amazing novel. I wish, and it's been translated into many languages. Before we're done, I'll find the title of it for you.
Yeah, please.
But it's I think it's important to get into other cultures, and it's one of the things, and I'm assuming Buenos Aires is the same way, that you're able to see a lot of foreign films, and it's a very cosmopolitan place to be, and Los Angeles is the same way.
Yeah, we love Buenos Aires because here there's a lot. I lived 2 years in Paris, and I still consider Buenos Aires a more cultural place. You can find anything here. There's a lot of festival. I mean, it's incredible. And again, it's a lot of writers. Actually, there's a meeting every month in a bar, in a traditional bar. They get together all the writers and directors of sci-fi and horror. It's very, very funny.
I have to come. I have to come to Buenos Aires.
Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to contact William Gibson. Have you read his work?
No. Oh, of course. Yeah. I haven't read his new novel, but I've read a lot of his work. Yes, of course.
Well, he did the prologue for Borges' Labyrinth.
Oh.
Yeah, he's a fan of Borges also, and he wrote. I will send you the text he wrote about Borges. Very, very nice. Also, Philip Dick. Actually, I'm sure you read Philip Dick. No, well, Philip Dick also read. There's I read an essay about Borges and Philip Dick that are really incredible. I will try to.
It is reading writers writing about other writers or filmmakers on filmmakers is really the best, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And what about you? Which is the writer you most? The script writer you admire the most? You will say, "Oh, this is the guy you should, look up to."
Well, I mean, for me personally, it has to be Rod Serling, because he wrote so many different kinds of stories that were groundbreaking, not only conceptually, but philosophically, and delved into thematic territory that you could never normally delve into in a movie or a TV or movies, through science fiction or fantastical metaphor. And that's what can be so powerful about metaphor in horror and science fiction and fantasy, is because you can look at things in a different way, and you can look at things that people don't normally look at. There's one of the best episodes of The Twilight Zone written by Serling that is not one of the famous ones, but I think is perhaps the best one. It's about a 5-year-old boy whose grandmother dies, and before she dies, she gives him a little plastic toy telephone. And she dies, and a few months later, he's playing with the phone, and we realize that he's talking to the grandmother. And the parents don't believe it at first, but then it turns out, and you never hear the woman, but you realize she's trying to talk the boy into joining her in death so they can be together. And it's terrifying and disturbing, and the boy actually drowns himself at the end of the episode and dies. And the end of the episode is the father on this stupid toy telephone, which should be silly, begging, you never hear the grandmother, begging the grandmother to let him come back. And the paramedics bring him back to life. And it's a story about loss and death, and this, no one can show a 5-year-old child committing suicide. That's pretty taboo, really, for the early 1960s or late 50s. But he was able to do it, And sorry to go on about that, but it's a great story. It's a scary story. It has a cool idea that had never been seen, and it explored loss from the perspective of a dead woman who felt the loss of her grandchild. It was like a reverse soul, in a weird way. And it's just an example of as what a brilliant writer he was. And he probably wrote it very quickly, you know.
Probably. And what about Borges? What's the most, the thing you admire the most, and what is the story, a short story you like the most?
Well, I remember The Garden of Forking Paths.
Yeah, and, great.
The Immortal, and
actually this Star Trek Generation episode with Worf, it's in parallel universe. I thought in that short story.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
really?
I was just. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it was It was that, obviously, but and at the time people weren't really talking about quantum physics and parallel universes. But Borges was thinking about it and using it to tell a story. And yeah, that was definitely inspired by Borges. Borges is like Rod Serling. I would say he's kind of the Rod Serling of Argentina. I can't pronounce the name of your country.
In Spanish would be Argentina. Do you speak Spanish?
Argentina. Un poquito.
Oh.
Porque yo vivo in Los Angeles.
Ah, claro.
You know, but there are some good Argentinian restaurants here.
Oh yeah, have you tried the meat?
Yeah, a lot of meat. Yes, delicious grilled meat. Yeah.
And and what about Julio Cortázar? Do you know him?
I don't think so. He sounded familiar, but no, I don't.
No, it's I have a lot of short story translated to English, and I start sending to all these directors from the US, and they were amazed about because it's like Borges, but it's different. Actually, there's a movie called Jacob's Ladder, the Iron Lane, who actually is based loosely on Cortázar short story. It's so great.
Can you spell his last name?
Julio Cortázar is Cortázar, Cortázar. And there's a movie called The Night, in English is La Noche Boca Arriba, The Night Face Up. I have it, I will send you. It's so great. I will send you. You have to read because there's a big big spoiler, and you will understand. And that book has inspired. Actually, I wanted to talk also with the script writers of Abismo. How you say the other Star Trek Deep Space Nine? Because I saw an episode. I said that's a Cortázar short story, and I wanted to talk to the script writers. So I say, did you read Cortázar? Didn't you? It's
you should reach out to Ron.
Yeah, who was the main? I don't remember because there was a lot of writers in.
The showrunner was a guy named Ira Stephen Bear was his name. Is his name?
Oh, are you in contact with him? I would like to talk.
Not really. No, I didn't work on the show, and I don't. I mean, we would say hi if we ran into each other, but I'm not friends.
No, because really, I mean, also in that series, the writing is so good. Actually, there is a documentary right now. I don't know if you.
Yeah. I haven't seen it, but it looks very good.
Yeah, it's about that, the writing process in a way, and it's so great. What about, you talk about horror movies, what about Japanese movies? Because there's a big tradition of Japanese horror films that have been remade in the US. Do you have any favorite?
I hope I get the title right. I think there was a Japanese horror film from the 70s called, I think it was called Ghost Story. I don't have my computer handy. But there were some Japanese ghost stories from the 1970s that really scared me as a kid. Way before The Ring. Though The Ring had quite an impact. You know, I was given that movie back when there was VHS tapes, and it was making the rounds here in Hollywood, and almost like the movie premise, like watch this. if you dare. And it was really, really, really scary. Sorry, I'm just trying to refresh my memory here, looking at my phone. But yeah, the Japanese horror was hard to find. I think the first thing I saw in a theater was Tetsuo, which must have been, it's not listed here, but it must have been the 1980s, I think, maybe. Yeah. And I don't know what you would call that. If you've seen it, science fiction horror, I'm not quite sure what you would call it. And look, I'm going to make a very strong argument that one of the great Japanese horror films is the original Godzilla. Because it was before Godzilla was a superhero. Godzilla was a metaphor for the Hiroshima. And if you watch the movie, particularly the one without the American added scenes, which aren't bad, it's a horror movie. It's a science fiction horror movie that is, the monster is terrifying. And it's like a lot of great horror, the traumas of the recent past are resurrected as a monster. And that was, at 6 years old, well, that was the first Japanese horror movie I saw.
What about the tradition in anime, like Akira, Ghost in the Shell, all the sci-fi tradition? Have you?
Yeah, I really enjoy those. In fact, I just saw one in the theater a few weeks ago by the guy. What was the big one that came out with the time travel elements? They're making it as a movie here. My God, my memory is so bad.
It's a new one because
one last one. What? It's the most famous anime director working today. This is so.
The Girl Who Traveled in Time. That one. It's based on a sci-fi writer.
I'll tell you in 1 second. Hold on. I just saw his new movie. Speaking of horror, I like Death Note.
Death Note is great. the anime, not the movie.
The anime.
Yeah.
No, the movie's terrible.
Yeah, I know.
The movie is terrible. So Spirited Away was very popular, but the one that I loved, which was very popular in Japan, was called Your Name. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen Your Name. It's great. And I just saw Weathering with You. Oh. The same directors in the theater here, and it wasn't as good as Your Name. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, anime, again, when I was growing up, hard to access.